Get that out of the way. And there we go. A picture from Fairy Creek. Jackie Larkin is a social justice activist for over 50 years in the women's, labor, and political action movements. She integrates a deep ecological and environmental justice perspective into her life work. An educator and facilitator working with the labor and community movements, she offers programs in leadership development with an emphasis on equity, strategic planning, facilitation skills, and the program called The Work That Reconnects. Jackie lives with partner Glenn and beloved dog Luca in rural Metchosin, and her daughter lives in Victoria. Jackie is one of the leaders of Elders for Ancient Forests. So over to you, Jackie, and just audience, so you're not surprised by this, I'm going to tell her when she's got 5 minutes left. You probably, there we go.
Great, I'm not muted anymore. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I want to start by acknowledging that my feet touch the ground. My home place is in the Chianu territory in the Metchosin area west of Victoria. And these lands are unceded and therefore stolen lands. And that leads me to my commitment to support the land rights of Indigenous communities all over this planet. I really appreciate your invitation, and perhaps some of you may have been participants in some of the protests that have happened over the last year with respect to the logging of old growth forests, and particularly Fairy Creek. And I want to appreciate and say my gratitude for your music in your service. It's lovely, and for your honoring of all the plant beings in the music that you've selected today. And as Attila was playing his forest piece, I was imagining him having some kind of electronic keyboard in the middle of Eden Grove up at Fairy Creek, and having the musicians talk to the trees through their creative ways. And I'm getting an idea about what we might do. So I asked Peter to put up that image of a very beautiful old growth tree with the children around it. And, you know, I wanted it to be there because I care about the future of our children and of their children and their children's children, but not because I want one big or even 100 big iconic trees to be there for us as humans to witness, to touch, to visit as tourists. I really wanted the image instead to be one that might, for you, evoke reverence and awe, and to be reminded of ancestry, both human ancestry and plant and all animal ancestries, and to encourage us to embrace our mutual interdependence. So I want to start by talking about why ancient forests are so important. And I'm going to begin with a little bit of a reading from a book that many of you may have heard of called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I guess if I have a Bible in my life, this is it. It's beside my bed all the time, and I read it generally. It's a bit about the forest and their place. Fluted trunks rise from a lawn of deep moss green, their canopies lost in the hanging mist that suffuses the forest with hazy silver twilight. Strewn with huge logs and clumps of ferns, the forest floor is a feather bed of needles dappled with sunflecks. Light streamed through holes over the heads of young trees, while their grandmothers loom in shadows, great buttressed trunks, 8 feet in diameter. You want to be quiet in instinctive deference to the cathedral hush, and because nothing you could possibly say would add a thing. These ancient forests, the coastal forest, used to spread from Northern California to Southeastern Alaska in a broad band between the mountains and the sea. Here is where the fog drips. Here is where the moisture-laden air from the Pacific rises against the mountains to produce upward of 100 inches of rain a year, watering an ecosystem rivaled nowhere in Earth, the biggest trees in the world, trees that were born before Columbus sailed. And trees are just the beginning. The numbers of species of animals, birds, amphibians, wildflowers, fern, mosses, lichen, fungi, and insects are staggering. It's hard to write without running out of superlatives, for these were among the greatest forests on earth. Forests peopled with centuries of past lives, enormous logs, and snags that foster more life after their death than before. The canopy is a multi-layered sculpture of vertical complexity, from the lowest moss on the forest floor to the wisps of the lichen hanging from the high in the treetops, raggedy and uneven from the gaps produced by centuries of wind-throw, disease, and storms. This seeming chaos belies the tight web of interconnectedness between them all, stitched with filaments of fungi, silk of spiders, and silver threads of water. Alone is a word without meaning in this forest. So I kind of couldn't resist this because she's far more eloquent than I could possibly be about these forests. And when I speak of the old forest, the old growth forest, I am focusing on what I know, which is the Pacific coastal forest, but I really want to emphasize that there are old growth forests throughout this province that have different ecosystem imperatives. I just want to say a few things that add to what Robin said about these precious, nurturing, and abundant ecosystems, which can never be replaced. Planting new trees could never recreate what these old ancient forests represent. They're a vital source of oxygen, like all plant beings, giving us the gift of the gases that give us breath. They're home to myriads of beings. They cool the planet. They hold and filter water. Just to stand up in Fairy Creek after a rainfall is an overwhelming sensation of how much water is flowing through that ecosystem and being filtered and held by all of the structures of the forest itself. They're the sources of medicines we don't even yet have a clue about. They sequester carbon. And as she says at the end there, they're connected as complex cooperative communities above and below the ground, which can show us as humans how to live. Because as Robin says, the plants are our oldest teachers. And when we cut them down and the land is scoured, the soil that's built up over millennia is washed away. And yes, there's new growth, but nothing like what has taken thousands of years to emerge. And not the least, these forests are the base of Indigenous identity. These forests and their ocean shores are the home ground for a variety of Indigenous nations for whom there is no separation between land and nation. And so the destruction of the land and the forest is the destruction of their identity. And for them, the forests provided, and especially the cedar, the tree, the great tree, food, clothing, shelter, medicines, and so much more. And then the last thing that I want to say, just to try to summarize what the importance of these forests are, is that they are our kin. We share DNA with the trees in our early evolutionary heritage before we diverged. We are living beings on a living planet, and they belong as much as we do. We depend on them more than they depend on us. And as I say this, I feel a grief arise in my chest, in my heart, because in this time, so much is threatened. It's painful to contemplate, and doing this work kind of forces me to do it every day. So I'm going to move now from a little bit of heart feeling to talking a little bit more cognitively about the BC forest industry and what's been happening. I want to say a few words about the history of logging in this province. The whole province is based on an economy which is a settler-based, profit-taking economy of extraction. And this history of extraction is tightly bound up with the theft of Indigenous land. Over and over and over again, not only were First Nations ignored, but their communities destroyed and their land base taken from them. And if they received anything in exchange, it was a pittance. And there's a very long history of governments giving control of quote unquote forested crown lands to the logging industry, and the weakening, especially in the last 30 years, of any independent controls that might rein the logging companies in. And now today, the majority of the logs, the big logs that are harvested, go to China, Japan, and the United States with very little value added. And we've seen a precipitous decline in jobs and the suffering of logging communities, those working class communities that were pushed into mining, into logging, into other extraction industries, and are always at the whim of large corporations who take the profits and then leave. And now, as an industry is declining, which it is profoundly, there is a rush to grab the very last old growth, which is less than 3% left of what used to be here. A couple of years ago, the government appointed a panel that produced what's called the Old Growth Strategic Review. You may have heard that. It's often referred to as the OGSR. And it said that we were in danger of irreversible biodiversity loss. And they made 14 recommendations, the two most priority ones being to defer logging in at-risk old growth forests now, like immediately, and to consult with First Nations. They made an election promise to implement all of those recommendations, and that has not yet, they have not yet been implemented. I'll return to this. But I want to take a little time now and talk about what the Fairy Creek Defense represented over last year. Of course, it's focused, what's that, 5 left?
Yep.
Thank you. It's focused in southern Vancouver Island, which is, there's precious little old growth left in Vancouver Island. This land is Pacheedaht land, and the Pacheedaht Nation have asked the protesters to leave. But on the sort of counterbalance to that, there have been Indigenous land defenders in the resistance led by Elder Bill Jones and a few younger members of the Pacheedaht Nation and Indigenous land defenders from other nations. So it's a complex situation, which maybe we can talk about in the exchange if you'd like. But it led to the greatest civil disobedience resistance that has been ever seen in Canadian history. The amount of creativity, persistence, and community building by these mostly young folks has been astounding. And on the other side, the brutality of the RCMP response compared to the treatment of the convoy protesters in Ottawa is unbelievable and says so much about the role of the police in this country of holding up the interests of industry rather than the interests of the public. So our elders group has done so many things. We started with a convoy last April. We've had many trips up to Berry Creek, cars and buses, working in solidarity. Very seldom people stayed overnight because we're older and it's harder to do. But we've been arrested with others. We've resisted the RCMP barriers in the inclusion zone of in their jurisdiction. We've raised something like $50,000 to pursue court cases, challenging the legitimacy of the injunction and the imposition of exclusion zones. We've done a huge amount of lobbying of MLAs, and we've done all kinds of actions in Victoria, including lying down in the streets outside the legislature and occupying the streets in the hope that we would get arrested. But it turns out that it's very difficult to be an elder and lie down on streets and get arrested in Victoria. So we haven't achieved that goal yet. So my time has gone way faster than I thought it would. So I'm just going to say that the Old Growth Strategic Review has mostly not been implemented. The government hid behind, in my view, the announcement that they were going to consult with First Nations as a way of slowing down their process and not implementing the deferrals that were required. And while there is some progress, and I can talk about that more in our exchange, we have a very long way to go, and the environmental organizations that have been very active have really made it very clear that the scorecard is in the D's and the F's, not in the A's or B's or C's. And the forestry industry is fighting back big time. Some of you may have seen the sign that was up on the freeway, which says, BC will never run out of old growth. This is from the logging industry and the loggers organization. So I'm going to wrap with saying I have a vision that I don't think that the provincial government shares, which is to stop all logging of at-risk old growth immediately, to immediately introduce Indigenous species legislation, to turn all of the Fairy Creek area into a Truth and Reconciliation Park, and to fully compensate the Pacheedaht people, and to really implement a paradigm shift in the forestry industry that moves towards sustainable forestry with permanent protection for old growth, a just transition for the communities that will suffer from the closing down of the industry, to stop clear cutting, which would be a fundamental change in the logging practices, and to start practicing what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls an honorable harvest in sustainable forestry. So I can say much more, but I've already spoken a little bit longer than I should. I'm wondering, Peter, if you can tell me if we have time for the last piece of music.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So I want to just introduce Luke Wallace, who spent many, many days and time up at Fairy Creek, including up on a platform playing his music. And this is one of his pieces that he's recently composed. And we're going to put